Hi everyone, welcome to the Sherlock and Pages Book Club show. This week we have an author interview with Gavin Plumley, the cultural historian. Welcome to the show, Gavin.
Thank you for having me.
And we will be discussing today your book, A Home for All Seasons, which just reached its second anniversary.
It did, yeah, published 2 years ago in hardback and now out in paperback and available as an audiobook as well. It's odd that it's been out for that kind of period of time. It sort of feels like it was only published yesterday, and yet it's so lovely to know that it has reached quite a lot of people so far. So
Yeah, and I was just saying before we started the podcast, we sold quite a lot of the book here at Sherlock and Pages at Christmas, and I'm not surprised because it kind of ticks so many of our boxes here at Sherlock and Pages in terms of landscape, history, nature. But having said that, it is quite a unique book, and I was thinking when I was reading it, only you could have written this book. So I think you should be really, really proud. But how do you describe it to people in a nutshell when you're at a dinner party describing the book that you've written to someone who hasn't read it?
I'm really bad at elevator pitches.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think that's to do with the kind of hybrid nature of the book. It's the story of my home. And the home featured in it is a 16th century cottage in Herefordshire, which I bought with my husband 6 years ago. And to be honest, it was never going to be a book. It was going to be, well, it was meant to be answering an insurance salesman's question about how old the place was in order that they could give us the buildings insurance. And then that kind of sent me on a wild goose chase. And that then snowballed and became really a love story, I suppose, about this place that felt just so instinctively mine, instinctively ours. And so what developed out of that was a narrative, a kind of historical detective story, I suppose. And in that, and living in the house, an exploration of the seasons and how we interact with that and how people who lived and worked in the house before us interacted with it. So, yeah, a kind of tapestry, I suppose.
And for those who might not know, can you explain Herefordshire, the landscape of Herefordshire? And actually, I wondered if you had any personal reflections on the fact that you ended up there, because it is kind of this hinterland between Wales and England, and you had a lot of Welsh family. It seems quite prophetic that that's actually where you ended up, looking back towards the homeland almost in some ways.
Yeah, it's Herefordshire is, I think, the third least populous English county. So after Rutland and the Isle of Wight, which are considerably smaller places than Herefordshire. And it's on the periphery. It's beyond the Malvern Hills, beyond most of the motorway system. It doesn't have that kind of immediacy of connection. And it is a place that really, it's kind of the county that time forgot in a really fabulous way. And it does sit very much within my biography. I was educated for my sins in the next county, and the less said about that, the better. But it is just about an hour and a half away from where my mum was born, on a farm high up in the Cambrian Mountains. My sister-in-law was raised in Hereford. We have lots of kind of connections with it, but nothing that kind of dictated that that's where we would end up. And it was when we moved west and were looking for a place that actually it just seemed such a place open for exploration, engagement, and finding our place within a community. And it's a very special place.
And can you explain to the audience, so you had quite a wide search area, didn't you, for a house? It was sort of a swathe of England where you could probably drive 2 hours north, 2 hours south, but towards the west side of the country.
Yeah, I mean, we're all being told to check our privilege, so I need to check my privilege right now, which is that we didn't have to live there. In fact, during term time, I live much closer to Sherlock and Pages. in Wells, where my husband Alistair is a head teacher. And we are very lucky to be given a place to live with that job. So in terms of our own property, we didn't have to find anything near work. But we did have to find something that wasn't miles and miles away. We didn't want to be up in the north of Scotland or at the end of Cornwall, or something that we could escape to. And so we did draw this enormous circle. I mean, in terms of square miles, I suppose, or round miles, around Alistair's place of work. And that gave us a line from pretty much where we are now, kind of down towards Oxford. And while I love the Cotswolds and, Partiator, to anyone who lives there, it did seem for me a little too tied up with a bow. Mm-hmm. And when we travelled west and towards the Welsh border, sort of found more real villages where, the tractors aren't nice tractors painted in red, sitting beautifully outside a tea room, but are actually tractors who do jobs during the harvest. And that kind of chimed with me because of being a farmer's grandson, at least, and that agricultural world into which I was born. And so that was, we had this great opportunity, and I hope we seized on it and made it ours.
Well, I think you definitely did, because not many people produce a wonderful book as a result of moving house. But how instinctive was the decision when you saw so the house that you ended up buying is called Steps House now, although it seems to have gone through very many different names and names, and it's all a bit mysterious, as people can find out in the book. But how instinctive was it for you? Because it seems like you were really making the push for the house when you and Alistair first visited.
Yeah, I mean, I do, I suppose I live by my instincts. And when we saw the house and indeed stepped over the threshold, I said, this is it. And we hadn't actually seen any of the rooms. And I have done that before when we've rented properties and when I found places when I was living in London and stuff that I just had that kind of sense. But this was something really of a different scale. I'm not entirely sure that I believe in love at first sight, but this was it, I suppose, or certainly the closest I've really come after meeting Alistair. And I don't know, there was something about the light, there was something about the feel, there was something about the smell of the place. And well, kind of in the smuggest I told you so, I did tell Alistair that this was it. And he was more reticent, and he is more reticent generally. He's much more considered and calm, which is a really good thing for me day to day. But I'm glad I persisted because it was a really good decision.
I think one of the things reading the book, it's a book of so many different themes and layers, but one of the themes that runs through the book is obviously your and Alistair's relationship. And the bits that made me laugh out loud is when you're often reflecting on Alistair and the love and affection that you have for him, but the honesty of what it takes in any real relationship where you annoy each other. And it's actually the foibles and quirks that are really the bread and butter of a relationship. I really enjoyed it, and it made me reflect on my relationship with Agat, who co-owns Sherlock and Pages as well. Particularly, there's a bit where you're talking about going to B&Q or IKEA, and Alistair can never get the right stuff, and then you're going back again. And I feel like I spend my life ferrying Agat back to home base. So yeah, I totally related to a lot of this, and I thought it was really nice. It's that honesty. It's not sort of like the cliche sort of portrayal of domestic life.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing I get wrong in the book, definitely about him, which is that he's asleep a lot in the book.
Right. Okay. I didn't notice that.
I hadn't noticed it at all. You go through several drafts, proofing stage, all of that stuff. And then one of Alistair's friends that we've known for years just said, he's always asleep though, isn't he? And I sort of had this horrifying realization that there are a number of moments where I seem to be out in the world doing things, and he's just lying upstairs in bed waiting for another cup of tea, which is actually completely unfair because he's devoted to his garden, and indeed when he does tasks in the house, several trips to B&Q, kind of making sure he's got the right stuff, the right tools.
Oh no, I think I think he praises industry in the book. I definitely took that away.
Good, I'm glad. I'm glad. I'm really glad.
And so this village is Pembridge. Can you give us a quick sketch of Pembridge? I feel like that another one of the main characters in the book, and somewhere where I'm desperate to go, is the New Inn, and grab a pint there. And that pub looks and sounds wonderful. So yeah, just a quick sketch of Pembridge.
Well, Pembridge is a small village of about 1,100 people. It's built basically on a crossroads. To the north is Bridge Street, to the south is Bearwood Lane and the Marketplace. And then going east to west is the A44, and East Street and West Street. So it's quite a basic village in many ways. The geography is not remotely complicated, but in the middle, at the slightly sort of staggered crossroads, is the Market Square, which is where our house is and where the pub is. I mean, the pub is basically as close as you are, pretty much, to me now, Luke, when you leave our front door. And it was there that we went, in fact, before we went into the house. And the landlady, Jane, has been there for 40 years this year. And she's worked throughout that time alongside her sister, Rosie. Rosie is in the kitchen. And I think it is a pub that, well, a friend came at the weekend and said, it's like a warm hug. It is a place that prompts the nostalgia, perhaps for a time that actually you and I never experienced. It's a pub that, has no music, no slot machines. But none of it is, painted in that pervasive sage color that seems to be in nice country pubs nowadays. It's a really fabulous place, very analog, I call it in the book, and that is the heart of the village. It is the community centre, effectively. There's another pub in the village, that's the Red Lion, and that's at the bottom of our garden, so we've got a choice of two, but right opposite the front door is the New Inn, and that was our extension, really, of our front room.
And there's kind of one central question in the book, which is, as you've talked about already, how old is the house that you purchased, Steps House? Because you had to answer that question for insurance purposes. But this led you really in depth into the history, and then that answer is partially the answers partially come to that question in the book. But then I imagined, whilst I was reading the book, of returning to the New Inn, and I'm there, and this is how I imagined it, that you and Alistair are there, and all of these characters from around the village, and maybe you've just returned from Vienna or something like that, where you've been lecturing or giving a tour or something. Could you explain to the reader what they should expect of the structure of the book? Because it is totally unique. You're kind of anchored in Pembridge, in the story of the house, in the layers of history of the house and of the surrounding landscape. But then there's these riffs on your career, I think, as a cultural commentator, particularly on the paintings of Bruegel. Where did this idea come to you from, and was it something that sparked the idea for the book in the first place?
Actually, all of that stuff happened very organically. The question, from the insurance guys, that happened during the summer that we arrived. We moved into the house in August. The book begins effectively in August. And it follows the course of a year from, as it were, the peak of one harvest to the beginning of another. And as all of that was happening, we were moving in, the insurance question was asked. I was then going off to Vienna, and part of my work is to lecture about art history, also music history. And one of the things I was doing was leading a tour through the Kunsthistorisches Museum when there was this Sock and Great Bruegel exhibition. And I was feeling homesick. I'd been away quite a bit after we'd moved. In fact, one of the things that was in an early draft of the book was a trip to New Zealand. And that was true to life. And I wanted the book to be absolutely true to life. I got rid of that because it was too many trips away and would have confused the reader. But all of that was part of this feeling away from a place that had been instinctively made our home. And as I was in the Kunsthistorisches Museum lecturing about the paintings we were seeing, along with Klimt and Schiele elsewhere in Vienna, I was looking at these amazing Bruegel season paintings from 1565. There were 6 originally. 5 survive. 3 of them are in Vienna. And in the midst of these broad paintings, compendious images of the world at that point in time, I saw this little timber-framed village. And of course, because I was feeling homesick, it was the timber-framed village I'd left behind. And so that suggested a layer to me. And I thought, it doesn't quite work though, does it? Because Bruegel's sort of Dutch from the Spanish Netherlands. Here I am in Vienna. Alistair's with the dog back in Pembridge. How on earth does this fit together? And indeed, full disclosure, some people who've read the book haven't bought this. But I absolutely believed that there was something in that. And at the same time, we were getting to know friends in Herefordshire who, in their house, had these amazing wall paintings. They'd just been uncovered. They'd taken down a stud wall and found these absolutely extraordinary wall paintings from the end of the 16th century. And in their investigations into that decorative scheme, they found out that part of the frieze, and perhaps other figures too, had come, in fact, from a decorative manual published by a man called Hieronymus Koch in Antwerp. And Hieronymus Koch was also a member of the Guild of St. Luke, your namesake. And the Guild of St. Luke was, like all the sort of city guilds, a way of representing a specific trade. In the case of the Guild of St. Luke, visual artists. And its members included Peter Bruegel the Elder. In fact, Hieronymus Koch and Bruegel were direct colleagues. They worked together on many, many projects. And then, of course, I was looking at a whole host of different things that are happening in the 16th century, like the Reformation, the religious wars in Northern Europe. And of course, it's the Dutch who come to Britain and teach us how to paint our landscape. Mm-hmm. So, okay, Bruegel doesn't himself come, but Marcus Gerets the Elder comes, and a whole host of other people after him. And in fact, the word landscape is a Dutch one. Yeah. It's given to us and it appears in our language at the beginning of the 17th century. And all of that is sort of informs the narrative of the book. So in terms of the structure, if it has one, it is the procession of the seasons through a year. And within each of those chapters, a theme that is represented, I suppose, on a personal level, on a historical level, and on a cultural level. Mm. And not only a personal, but a level that happens within the life of the village. And some of the links are absolutely direct, and some of the links are much looser, much more mutable. But I wanted people to read through the book this layering of life lived, represented, and remembered.
I found myself reading the book, settling into the book. I think the first 100 pages or so really about the decision to buy the house, and then investigating the house and its history. And there's some really brilliant writing about how exciting that process is. And going around the house with some experts, looking at various different features and settling on the original dating of the house, which still seems to be slightly mysterious. Yeah. But there's a beauty in that. Then these other layers of history come, and I I wondered, because in the start of the book, you do say that you're quite an urban creature, that you kind of saw yourself in London. I think at that time you were often visiting these, great theatres of culture
Yeah.
abroad. For me, what I kind of felt like was this was, your love letter. This was you falling in love with these landscapes, with these characters, and then linking it to your life, your career. And there's something really enjoyable with that. And there's almost this like novel type quality about returning to Pembridge. So for me, it was unusual. And I settled into it. But once I did that, I really, really enjoyed the book. It like you said, it was a warm hug. I found it was like that. But there is a lot of really amazing historical anecdotes as well.
Well, I mean, what I wanted to do, I mean, it does have this kind of immediate chronology, and I suppose it is cumulative because probably the first gear changes, and I try to make them as smooth as possible. I drive an automatic, so I don't really have to think about it when I'm driving, but I tried to make them as smooth as possible when I was writing them. I guess they become more well worn over the course of the narrative, and certainly the sort of breaks that happen within the book feel sort of more natural as it goes along because you're used to that hybrid style. But what I wanted to do at the very beginning of the book was create a picture of life in that house, as it were, separate from time. And that's why there is this prologue, this prelude, I call it, using quite obviously a musical term, which is intensely lyrical and, as it were, has no context and just sort of places the reader, well, actually in bed with me and Alistair drinking our tea, and in fact the dog lying at the bottom of the bed of a morning, probably in early autumn. And that was really, really important for me, that it got bedded in, so that you knew what you were journeying towards as well as a reader. And that introduced history, culture, the personal, and the context of the village itself.
Well, I think that start really did work for me. It really grabbed me in. And as I said, I really felt like it was you falling in love with this landscape and some of the stories. And there are some that are so good, I wondered if you could slightly expand on them. There is a farmer, and this astonished me. Could you tell us about the last drovers of Britain and how you discovered the story of them with a farmer in Herefordshire?
So I was, well, there are lots of kind of overlapping little bits that within this jigsaw puzzle.
Maybe we should explain what a drover is.
So the drovers were itinerant farmers. They had bases in the Highlands of Britain. So basically the Cambrian Mountains in Wales, Cumbria, and Scotland. And those areas with large amounts of pasture and high pasture as well were great for livestock, for fattening sheep and cows, and fattening them to the extent that you could then drive them, as in push them through the landscape in great processions across Wales, across Cumbria, across Scotland, down into basically the southeast, where the meat could command a much higher value, and particularly to be slaughtered at Smithfield.
Because of London and its capital wealth and...
Yeah, all of that. And, and the Englishmen basically loving roast beef.
Yeah.
I mean, the French call us le roast beef.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely true that that's how these farmers basically made their living. And that's the basic story of it. But what I was fascinated by was their legacy and what marks they had left in the landscape. And Rob McFarlane has touched upon this. It is a kind of network of paths. And they were particularly fascinating for me because I knew about the drovers from my grandfather. and the drovers used to pass through his land up in the Cambrian Mountains. He was a sheep farmer. He was a sedentary sheep farmer, but he remembers, from his childhood, there was a railway strike, and the drovers couldn't put their livestock back on the trains as had replaced their system, but then had to drive them once more, and they had to ask their fathers and grandfathers how they did it. But it was actually in Pembridge talking about this and sort of just mulling over this idea and all the paths that had passed through the village over time, that I was chatting to one of the local farmers. He'd actually moved to another village, but he was back in the pub. And he said, Gavin, what you need to do is go up to Hardwick, which is one of the hamlets, one of the sort of collections of farm buildings just beyond the village. He said, and there you'll see a clump of Scots pines. And I said, why are they important? And he said, well, because they planted them. And Scots pines were basically used, because they have a distinctive shape and they grow quickly, for the drovers to mark out where they could safely pasture their sheep, largely, their cows too, while they rested for the night. And they normally indicated friendly farms or friendly pubs or places where that you could be for the night without the locals going, oh, off you go, we don't want you around here. Because they were also sort of considered vagabonds, and the Welsh was a word used, particularly around Pembridge, as a sort of way of indicating someone that you didn't really want around. But there, they were allowed to stay. And I went up there and saw this amazing circular clump of Scots pines, which is indeed where they rested overnight. And those Scots pines are markers of those routes. And these are routes like the A303 or the A5 or the A44 that goes through Pembridge that survive now. And when you look at a map of Britain, of course, they do exactly what the drovers did. Drive down towards London on these big trunk roads. And the whole network of these is there to be found. Of course, in the Highlands, they become paths and they go up over hills and packhorse trails. But it is basically the Ordnance Survey laid out by farmers.
Yeah, and I was just astonished to read about all sort of living memories, or literally living memories in these Scots pines of that history. Truly remarkable to uncover that. I wondered, when you're writing about these characters from Pembridge, now I've moved to a little village before for 3 years in Derbyshire. I lived in Enza near Chatsworth House. I imagine if I wrote a book about that little place, it would have caused a bit of a sensation. How was this received in Pembridge was one of the biggest questions I had.
I think it's been received pretty well. There are a couple of people who have taken me to task on things, and have questioned some of my suppositions, some of my theories. But I think I tried to be judicious. I tried to be kind, and certainly I've had a good experience in the village. So there was no axe to grind, as it were. And I also just, this wasn't going to get a legal read. So I just wanted to avoid anything that could cause any issues. There were a couple of moments where I had to take a deep breath and say, no, this is essential. It has to go in. I got the age of someone wrong. I put them in their 80s when they should be in their 70s, though he's now in his 80s, so it's fine. But no, actually, it's been really warmly received. And I'm really happy to say that as a result of the book, people now come to the village.
I was going to say, has there been any Pembridge tourism as a result?
There has been a bit. And
do they peer into your house?
Yeah, and they knock on the door.
Wow.
And they certainly go to the pub and they certainly go to the church as a result of that. And someone turned up from Melbourne in Australia, which was... she was coming to Britain already. There's no great claims that I sort of, should be getting commission from British Airways or something. But it was really lovely, actually, that it had spoken to them.
I can relate to that because we've had a few of those occasions here at Sherlock and Pages where people have dropped in whilst on their visits to Britain, which is very special to have had that influence on someone. But Gavin, I think I first became aware of you and your work because of our mutual love of historic churches. Well, I think mine is a little bit more niche on the historic
and much more determined as well.
But historic architecture and landscapes more generally, perhaps. So St Mary's in Pembridge, certainly on your Instagram, it looks like it's worth a visit. But there are some astonishing churches in that area. What are some of your favourites?
St Mary's in Pembridge itself is an obvious favourite because I see it out of my bedroom window every day, and getting to know that church, being in it so often. Of course, the more you study something, the more you see. But sadly, because of the Reformation and all the violence and vandalism of the 16th century, a lot of its original features have gone, including what must have been an absolutely astonishing rood screen. But there are many others to be found, and two of my real favourites are St Margaret's, I think it's called, in Michael Church, and it's quite hard to find. It's very much on its own. It really does feel like the church in J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country, which is a real touchstone for me, and I know it's a major touchstone for you guys here at the shop. It's just a very special, small, but hugely impressive church with this absolutely exquisite screen in it. And then just over the border into Wales, at Patricio, there is high up in the Black Mountains, this really special pilgrim church, which has a separate pilgrim chapel dedicated to, they think he was a hermit, St. Isui, who is remembered in a really beautiful modern sculpture there. But that also has an absolutely wowing, very intricate rood screen with lots of pomegranates and vines carved through it. Really special place.
Just from you describing it, I know that one. I sort of Google historic churches around the country all the time, but this one is a recurring one.
Yeah. Have you been there?
No, I've been to neither of them.
Right.
I have been to some Herefordshire churches, the famous Kilpeck.
Well, Kilpeck's you know, and Kilpeck is wowing because of the stone carving there.
Yeah, and Abbey-Dore as well, which gets a name check in the book.
Good. Yeah, that's not far from St Margaret's actually. So it's I think the really special one though, and actually less sophisticated than both of those, is above Talgarth, which is just beyond Hay-on-Wye, and up in the hills there, again on its own, and part of that amazing charity, the Friends of Friendless Churches, which I absolutely cannot praise more, is this really strange medieval church with this blood red rood screen. And there's something that happens when you go there. It really does feel like you're in touch with something else. And that comes, of course, with the remoteness of Herefordshire and the immediate surrounding areas. It's an endless pursuit. And every time we go back to one of these places, I just think, gosh, why haven't we been here for so long? And it's a very special thing to have those survivors.
Well, I think we might have to be some of those tourists who come to Pembridge and knock on your door,
absolutely,
and have a pint in the New Inn, and then go to these churches. That would be wonderful if we could have a follow up. And it's funny you mentioned J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country, because I kept on conflating A Home for All Seasons with A Month in the Country, and they have a similar feel in some ways. So I think that's a really nice note to end on. What are you up to now, Gavin? What's the new projects? Lots of lecturing, I see.
Loads of lectures. Yeah, I do a lot of work for the Art Society, so I'm up and down the country doing that. I'm researching a new talk about Welsh art, in fact, which I'm giving at the Prestine Festival this summer. But I've also been working for the last year and a bit on my second book, which is in the hopper, shall we say. I don't know when that's going to come to fruition. Fingers crossed. The vagaries of the publishing world are such, but it's a very different book. It's not a personal book. It's of a different period and a much darker period, even darker than the Reformation and the Plague, and traces one object through time. That's something that really fires me, taking something and, one thing and saying, what does this tell us about the world in which it was created? Very much like Neil McGregor did, of course, and those amazing podcasts. And it's a very passionate project, but of a completely different hue and much closer to my day work, which is often based in Central Europe and Austria and Germany.
It's funny you said that, because literally just behind your right shoulder is River Kings, which looks at one Viking item of jewellery, I believe, found in Derbyshire, and follows it all the way through its history.
Yeah, amazing.
To Iraq and India beyond, I think. So those histories are something that we love here at Sherlock and Pages. We have a shelf of history of commodities and objects. So I hope one day we can add this second book, which is in the hopper, but I sense that we can't really say too much more on that.
Not at the
for
moment.
now.
No, I'd love to, but it's also that thing of that natural trepidation about, it's my baby at the moment and it hasn't yet been put out.
Yeah.
So I'm really pleased with how it's going so far.
Well, I think you have been really courageous with a Home for All Seasons. I think, like I said, is it a book that only you could have written? And at the end of the day, that's character, and that is to be admired. So I'm quite proud on your behalf.
Thank you. That's really
the book.
sweet.
I think it's covers such a breadth of topics. I think the anchoring of your move to Pembridge, your relationship with Alistair, and then with all of the characters of the village, layered with all of that history, just makes for a fantastic read. I think people who like Sherlock and Pages will really enjoy it. And I think, it's to be admired for being unique. So who knows, maybe we'll get some more people to knock on that door, or at least have a pint at the New Inn one day. So I should show the book, of course, A Home for All Seasons. You've probably seen this on our Instagram if you've been following us for a while, because it has been in our window on a regular cycle, you'll be pleased to know, and we'll get a big pile of them for our central display table here at Sherlock and Pages. So Gavin, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
We hope we can have you again, maybe in a few years' time.
That'd be great.
All right, cheers.